Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first skill building session of the semester, where we will cover some tips for effective essay organization. I'm Angela Francis, the Assistant Dean of General Education and First Year Experience. A bit of housekeeping first. If you have any questions as I go over everything, please remember to post them in the Q&A section. If you have any technical issues, like you stop being able to hear me or can't see the captions, please post those in the chat. And of course, please feel free to chat in the chat. I try to skim it, but I worry I will miss any questions that are posted there rather than the QA. So chatting and tech help in the chat, questions for me in the Q&A. With that covered, let's get started. Here's our agenda for the evening. I will start with a reminder of the writing process that I covered in the Essay Writing Tips webinar, since emphasis on the steps before sitting down to work on those drafts can really save you a lot of time and frustration in the long run. If you haven't been to that webinar or it's been a hot minute, that's okay. We'll put a link to the recording in an email to you shortly after the webinar. Then I'll cover some ways that you can design a more persuasive essay. That includes things like the audience you choose to write for, Toulmin's model, and rhetorical appeals. We'll move on to crafting effective paragraphs, including paragraph structure and that mysterious writing that flows idea. And then I will give you my favorite tip for tackling longer writing assignments before we have a QA session. So if you've heard the talk about writing, essay writing before, you might remember that there's a 5-stage writing process that I suggest. Let's make sure you have this process fresh in mind. The steps are the following. First, you want to break down the assignment to make sure you understand exactly what it's asking of you and what essay organization you should use to tackle it. That's when you should be annotating the assignment sheet and checking the rubric to make sure you understand what an A paper is in each particular case. Then you'll develop a preliminary thesis. Remember that a thesis is a topic plus your position on it. So cats are better than dogs. And yes, we are using that example again tonight. Not in this paper. I will discuss which are better, cats or dogs. Remember, the latter of those gives a topic, but it doesn't give a position. Next, you'll research the topic, generally going beyond what's been provided for you in class. And remember here that you aren't just researching to support your thesis. You are researching the topic and making sure your thesis is correct. This is often called researching around the topic. Step 4 is to refine your thesis based on what you learned in your research and to really nail down your organization. And I suggest using an outline to do this. And then you'll finish with the drafting process, the actual writing of your paper. There's that down draft where you focus on getting your thoughts down, the up draft where you work to fix it all up so it makes sense to your reader, and the dental draft where you do all of the proofreading it needs to make it shine. So again, I just covered that really quickly, but it was covered in depth in the Essay Writing Tips webinar. So you can give that a watch if you are interested. With that covered, let's move on to our first big topic. Designing a more persuasive essay, because make no mistake about it, you design your essays. You decide what types of arguments to make, when to make them, and how to make them to your particular audience. And the more mindful you are about this, taking into account the specifics of your assignment, the better your chances are at writing a stellar paper. I'm going to tell you about 3 things to consider, and you should think about these early on in your writing process, starting when you're breaking down that assignment and all the way through to when you're working on your organization. The first is your audience, and specifically, you should be writing for a skeptical reader. The second is an introduction to the key parts of the Toulmin Model. And the last is going to be Aristotle's appeals, sometimes just called rhetorical appeals. When it comes to writing for your audience, one mistake that people make is that they preach to the choir. That means you're making an argument for an audience that already agrees with you. So for example, with my preliminary thesis that cats are better than dogs, preaching to the choir might look like picking super subjective points as evidence, like cats are cuter. It might look like ignoring things that dog lovers might have to say, like dogs are loyal. But in the end, when you preach to the choir, you're less likely, to convince the skeptical members of the congregation. So don't do this. Instead, write for a skeptical audience. And if it helps, think about this guy as your reader. We'll be nice and say he's an intelligent, rational, skeptical, and willing to be convinced, but not about to make it easy for you. Because in my example's case, he thinks golden retrievers are at least as cute as most cats. How do you write for a skeptical reader? Well, the first thing to do is imagine their points. So if I'm writing an essay from the position of cats being better than dogs, I need to understand why folks might think dogs are better than cats. This is something you can find out during your preliminary thesis, because remember, you aren't doing research just to find information to support your thesis. You're researching around a subject. Once you know their point of view, pick evidence that is going to be able to convince that audience. The choir is already going to follow you along anyway. They have already decided that cats are the best. But if your research shows that dog lovers are likely to be thinking dogs are better than cats because they're more loyal, maybe studies showing cats' loyalty and emotional attachment to their owners are something to include. When you do this, you can acknowledge your audience's concerns through what's called a rebuttal. You might hear about this as a rebuttal paragraph, but this is essentially where you state the opposing point of view and then demonstrate the flaws in that argument. An important thing to do here is pick the most powerful argument against your thesis that you can convincingly speak against and say why that argument is wrong. Now that we've covered audience, let's start talking about the actual structure of your arguments. Toulmin's model has more to it than I'm going to cover here, but here are the 3 main parts of an argument in this model: the claim, the grounds, and the warrant. The claim is your assertion. It's the thing you want to persuade your reader about, like your thesis, which is the main point of your paper, or as we'll see, your topic sentences. The grounds are the pieces of evidence that support that assertion. And the warrant is an assumption that links the grounds to the claim. It might be spoken or implied, but it's what makes the evidence relevant to your claim. Let's look at an example. So, like cats, I'm nothing but if not loyal. So my claim is that when it comes to city pets, cats are often a better choice. Well, I need evidence for that. So let's say my evidence is that cats adopt their owners' personalities, which means they'll fit in better with their household. There's an assumption being made here that people want a pet that shares their personality traits. And as the writer, I'll have to decide if I need to make that point in writing and perhaps prove it, or if I can just leave it unspoken. While Toulmin breaks arguments down into more pieces than this, if you remember these 3 things while outlining your arguments, you'll be in good shape. So the claim is the point you're making. The grounds is your evidence, and the warrant is the connection between the two. While that covers the basic structure of an argument, it's important to remember that there are multiple types of arguments you can make. The example I gave before was a logical argument, and most of your evidence in academic papers will be the same. But Aristotle defined 3 main types of appeals to your audience that you can use. In addition to logos, that's your logical argument, they are on the bottom of the screen. There's also ethos, an appeal based on credibility, and pathos, an emotional appeal. Your arguments can integrate more than one of these appeals, though I'd suggest making sure logic is carrying the brunt of the weight of your argument in an academic setting. So let's look at how that would work. Logical appeals attempt to use facts to convince the reader. This can include things like statistics, charts, graphs, or other numerical data. It can also include historical data, analogies, or other results of scholarly research. In the course of making a logical appeal, you have to walk the reader through your reasoning. So you won't just put some facts or quotations in a paragraph and walk away. Instead, you'll connect your evidence to each other, and as we'll see, we'll make sure that it's clear how that evidence connects back to your thesis. Now, let's say I wanted to integrate emotional appeals into this. Commercials are masters of doing that. Just think about the ones for the ASPCA with Sarah McLachlan playing in the background as sad, homeless animals stare at you from the screen. You don't want to go that far, but you can make an emotional appeal by using facts that tug at your reader's heartstrings. Make them feel angry, hopeful, or whatever emotion best helps your argument at the time. So if I have multiple studies to choose from about cats' attachments to their owners, it might be good to pick the one that shows cats crying for their absentee owners or waiting for owners who have moved to return to come get them, because that's sad rather than just a fact. You might use descriptive language here. Just remember to keep it appropriate for an academic essay. And images are masterful at emotional appeals. But again, if you doubt the appropriateness for your setting and your audience, skip the images. I wouldn't use this picture in an essay, but clearly I would use it in a PowerPoint deck. Lastly, you have appeals based on the author's credibility. As a student, this is often going to come into play regarding the strength of your resources and your author credibility rather than your own. And this is part of why internet research can be dangerous if you aren't careful with it. You want to make sure that your sources are written by credible authors, and that includes also knowing that the resources are timely, that is, written fairly recently, why those authors might have written the research in question. I am not saying that you can't ever find strong sources online. You can. Just be careful. And I'd suggest starting with the library databases instead. So let's say you've used all of the things I just mentioned to match the shape of your argument with the assignment you need to complete. And you've done your research accordingly, researching around the topic to make it so that your thesis and organization are truly the best they can be for a skeptical but rational reader. You'll start writing at that point, and in order to have an A-range paper, you're going to need to craft effective paragraphs. So we're going to cover what those are, specifically what a paragraph even is, because it isn't determined by a particular number of sentences. We'll talk about topic sentences, types of evidence you can include, and the all-important flow. So what's a paragraph? A paragraph conveys a single idea to your reader. And that idea rather, is represented in the topic sentence, which is the first sentence of your paragraph. After that, it provides support or evidence that backs up your idea. So if you're thinking about what we just covered, your topic sentence is a claim and the evidence is the grounds. The paragraph will conclude with a sentence that either sums up the point or provides a transition to the next paragraph's point. Here's some more about topic sentences, since they are so incredibly important. Not only are they the main point of your paragraph, but they also connect back to your thesis. And at the same time, everything in your paragraph needs to connect to it. So think of the topic sentence as the bridge between the thesis and your evidence. As a result, your topic sentences should usually be in your own words, with the exception of if you are going to be discussing a quotation in the paragraph. And a way to check to make sure that you have strong topic sentences is to skim your work once you have a full draft. That's when you read the first and last sentence of every paragraph. If you can do that and end up following your argument well, you are doing pretty good with your topic sentences and concluding sentences. Let's talk about evidence as well. Just as a reminder, you're going to support your topic sentences with a variety of different types of evidence. And you should think about the best types for the points you're trying to make. It might be primary sources like journal entry, or secondary sources like a scholar writing about that journal entry. It could be quantitative data. It might take the form of quotations, paraphrases, or summaries. Just remember, whatever evidence you use, your voice is the key one here. The connections you're making between sources make up your argument. My favorite analogy is to say that your resources are background singers. They're to make you sound good, but not to steal the spotlight. Now let's turn to flow, because this is something that can throw a lot of writers off. When someone says that writing flows, they often mean that it reads well. But what does that mean? Well, first, it's easy to follow the overall organization of the essay. So the paragraphs are in an order that makes sense to the reader. Your reader is never left feeling like you are jumping around the topic. Next, the paragraphs themselves have a logical structure. And lastly, there is varied sentence structure. To help with organizational flow, I always suggest working from an outline. You don't have to marry it, but the process of making an outline gets you thinking about which ideas make logical sense in which parts of your essay. Regardless of if you make an outline, though, remember that you're going to make it clear how ideas connect with one another. You can also think carefully about how you order your main points in your essay. A common way to do this is to put your most obvious point first and your strongest point last. That means that the middle points are convincing enough, but nothing particularly stunning. Of course, you don't have any filler in your essay, so they're all pretty good points. When we're talking about paragraph level flow, remember that topic sentences come first and sum up the paragraph's one idea. It's followed by evidence. And you're thinking here about which rhetorical appeals to use. And if you need to make any of your warrants, that's the assumptions connecting your evidence, followed by some sort of concluding sentence. And the evidence, that's basically making sure that the evidence connects to the topic sentences as well as the sentences that surround them. So ideas should connect directly to one another. One big point that I highly recommend is that you avoid ending a paragraph with a quotation. And I also suggest avoid ending a paragraph with a question. In fact, I suggest avoid using rhetorical questions generally, because you never know if your reader is going to give you an answer you are not prepared to answer back to. In terms of flow at the sentence level, this is often avoiding that choppy rhythm when you read something out loud. So when you're editing, you want to keep an eye out for varied sentence structure. If you're curious about how to write different types of sentences, I suggest looking up sentence clauses. When I was an undergraduate student, understanding clauses really helped me figure out how to go from short, choppy sentences to more complicated ones without jumping straight into run-ons. You can then add transition words to your sentences to help. For example, to signify additions, you could say moreover or additionally. To contrast two things, you might use however or despite this. To concede a point, you could say that being said. Or to emphasize something, you might say in fact or indeed. Double check the order of your sentences to make sure that they are all in an order that makes sense. So just like you would double check the order of your paragraphs, you are looking to make sure that your sentences are proving points in an order that your reader can understand. So if they need to know something in order to understand the conclusion or the concluding point of your paragraph, make sure that that information comes early on. So let me put all of this together with an example paragraph. This is rebuilding a paragraph that I wrote a good while ago. It is not perfect, but writing never is. If you were writing an outline, you might have these 3 points on it. And notice the sentence structure at this point is different for each sentence, but there's still no flow if you read these bullets from beginning to end. So I'll do so really quickly. There is loss through his son's death and the end of his marriage. He experiences a great fall from being a respected member of society to living alone in an unspecified location without any social connections. There is death, if a metaphorical one. So that sounded a little bit odd, especially between the second and third sentence. I also want to note that you as the reader need to figure out what in the world I am talking about. And that's because there is no topic sentence. So step 1 is to add a topic sentence. In this case, it's that the conclusion of the story I'm talking about shows the different sorts of unhappy endings in love stories. But while this is better, and it looks kind of like a paragraph, it can still be better than this. Because remember, you want a concluding sentence. That can be a sentence that links to the next point, or as this one does, just a sentence that serves the same purpose as the conclusion of your entire paper. It sums up the significance of what came before it. With that, we are in pretty good shape. But if you were to read this paragraph out loud, it would still be choppy. So we can add some transitions. The first one, in contrast, is establishing a connection to whatever paragraph came before it. That helps with the flow between ideas because you are walking the reader between or along your main points. The next one, where it says there's also exile, suggests addition. And lastly, at the end, it lets the reader know that I am finished making this point. You can think of these words as signposts because they tell your reader where you're going. So here's the end result, and I'll read it aloud again so that you can see how it sounds. In contrast, The conclusion depicts many types of the love story's unhappy endings. There is loss through his son's death and the end of this marriage. There's also exile, a great fall from being a respected member of society to living alone in an unspecified location without any social connections. Lastly, there is death, if a metaphorical one. All of this is the result of the narrator's failure to voluntarily accept who Anna really is. Now, you still have no idea what I'm talking about because you haven't read this book, but this is clearly a complete thought. I had a claim in the beginning with that topic sentence. I had grounds or evidence that followed it. This was a logical appeal, and I end it with a sentence that fully concludes the point. So lastly, now that we've talked about the different types of arguments and how to structure them down to a paragraph level, I want to talk about how to tackle a longer writing assignment. I'll use a 10-page paper as my example here, because in my courses, that tends to be the point where students start really not being sure how to approach the assignment. We'll cover 3 things here. The first is understanding why the paper is so big. What is the larger story here? Then we'll talk about organizational statements, since those are especially important in longer papers. And lastly, we'll talk about my favorite method for approaching longer pieces of writing, the paper within a paper method. Because this is all about overall structure and how you approach the assignment, you want to begin thinking about this right from the beginning, making sure that you understand what the assignment is asking of you. So you get hit with an assignment for a 10-page paper. Why is the paper so long? Well, page requirements, regardless of if they're long or short, are giving you clues about the scope or reach of the thesis. The longer the paper, the larger your main point can be. This can be in terms of the depth of the argument, so how detailed you're going to get, but can also be in the breadth of the argument, how wide or big it is. If you find yourself tempted to pad your paper by writing unnecessarily complicated sentence structures or repeating yourself, and you'll know if you're doing that because you'll be saying, as I said before, that's a sign that you misjudged the type of thesis statement you can support in your essay. At that point, go back to researching. Look to see if there's some sort of complexity that you've missed. Is there a rebuttal that you haven't included, but should? To help avoid those things, pre-writing activities like outlining are especially important for larger essays. Likewise, an organizational statement can help keep you from getting lost in the writing process. Even in a shorter essay, it tells your reader what to expect in your essay, both in terms of the main pieces of support and the order that they will appear. The organizational statement can be a part of your thesis sentence, or it can be a sentence all of its own. So here is an example that's familiar to those of you who watched the other essay webinar. My thesis is in bold when it comes to, or on the top, and it's when it comes to city pets, cats are often a better choice. But now let's make this thesis stronger. I can add a because and say, when it comes to city pets, cats are often a better choice because they have a smaller carbon footprint, are less expensive, and adopt their owner's personality, which means they usually fit in well with the rest of the household. Everything after the because, the things on the bullet points, that's my organizational statement. You as the reader would now know to expect me to cover those exact points in that exact order. You're primed and you're ready to go. I, as the reader, know what I need to cover. It's harder for me to get lost while I'm writing my draft. And when you're writing a longer paper, that is especially helpful because you can break the large paper down by writing a shorter paper for each part of your organizational statement. Let me show you more about how that would look. Let's say I have to write a 10-page paper on cats versus dogs, and I'm sitting here like I don't have enough to say about this. This is dumb. But when I write my organizational statement, using that, I can now create 3 thesis statements, one for each part of the organizational statement, and I can tackle the paper that way. So, using my last thesis and organizational statement, my first short paper would be about how cats are often a better choice because they have a smaller carbon footprint. The second short paper would be about how cats are less expensive, and that makes them a better choice. And the third and last mini paper is about how cats adopt their owner's personality, making them a better choice than dogs as a pet. What does that look like in terms of page counts? Well, this is an example. You still need an introduction and a conclusion, which means you can effectively write 3 2 to 3 page papers, an introduction and a conclusion, and end up with a glorious 10-page paper. If you use this method, there are a few things to consider. The first is that each of these pieces may need to have a heading in your paper, depending on how abrupt the topic shift is. That's like a second title. The second thing to remember is that you need to be very deliberate with your outlines. So don't repeat yourself in the different quote unquote papers. Figure out how they fit together by writing an outline of the overall 10-page structure and the different short papers. So let me make some final suggestions, and then I'll be turning to the QA. So if you have questions, do pop them there. My first suggestion is to think about the essay's structure and angle early on. The earlier you think about this, the clearer you're going to have a path forward while you're drafting, and the less rewriting and reworking you're hopefully going to need to do. Figure out your paragraph structure while you revise, not while you write your first draft. When you're writing your first draft, focus on just getting the ideas down. Once you've gotten the ideas down, you can revise to make sure that it would work for your reader, that it would make sense for your reader. But if you worry about paragraph structure from the beginning, you're going to censor yourself, and that censorship might cost you some really great ideas. Think about flow toward the very end. So you had a draft where you've gotten the ideas down. You've had a draft where you're like, okay, what paragraph structure makes sense? What order of my paragraphs makes sense? Where should I put my rebuttal? Only after you've done all of that work should you worry about flow. That's putting in those transition words, making sure that your topic sentence reflects what's in the paragraph after it, making sure that the last sentence of your paragraph helps lead to the paragraph that follows. All of that is flow. And you want to do that toward the end because you want to do that after you've made all of your other changes. Remember that your writing process is your own, but that it can change depending on the assignment you're working on. So I like outlines clearly, but outlines might not be for you. Maybe you're someone who likes to draw things on paper and make lines between the different ideas and connections. Maybe you like to use a PowerPoint slide for each idea and use the bullets on the slide for the sub ideas. Maybe you have some other way of organizing your process that I've never heard of. That's okay as long as it works for you. Just give yourself the space to use a different writing process when you are working on a different type of assignment. Because I know I work on or write a different way when I am writing a 10-page paper than I do a 3-page paper, then I do creative writing, then I do the material for this PowerPoint deck. So give yourself some freedom and be kind to yourself while you're writing. That is it. So we are going to turn to the QA. And again, if you have questions, please do add them there because that's where I'm looking. So one person has asked, when you are searching for potential evidence for your essay, how would you know that the source you're getting it from is credible? I would say you need to know the author. So there needs to be a named author. You need to know when it was written. And you need to know if there was any ulterior motive for it to be written. Part of that is based on where are you finding this source. And this is why materials from the databases, peer-reviewed sources, you might have heard that. That's why those are usually held as the gold standard in most fields, because a peer-reviewed source is one that other experts in the field have read and have agreed is really moving the field forward, saying something important and true. So that's part of why you might hear that you need to only use peer-reviewed sources, or that you can't use sources from the internet. It's really trying to make sure that you're just getting the sources that have been vetted before you get to them. But look at the author, look at the source that's printing or posting online this piece of information, look at when it was written, and the amount of time it takes for materials to get out of date varies by field. So if you are in doubt or unsure, ask your professor about how much time it takes for a material to become out of date in your particular field or discipline. And when you know that information, that will help you evaluate if it is a credible source. So there is a question about warrants. Give me a moment to go back to that slide. So please hold. While I go backward. All right. So hopefully you all are seeing the Toulmin model slide on there. And just a brief cover of it one more time. Remember that the claim is the assertion you're making. It's your thesis or your topic sentence, something like that. The grounds is the evidence and the facts that help support the claim. And the warrant is the assumption that links the grounds to the claim. So I'm going to try to make one up off the top of my head. Dogs are better pets in cities than cats. That is my claim. Because dogs are able to guard their owners' homes more effectively than cats can. That's grounds, right? That's evidence that supports my claim. The warrant, there's a couple there. One is that homes in the city need protecting. The other is that people would rather have a dog protect their home than an alarm system, right? I'm making assumptions about why someone would want a dog, how they would use a dog, and that's supporting my claim. I'll try to think of another one that's not related to cats and dogs. My mind is so stuck on cats and dogs, it's terrible. All right. When you are in the city, it is more effective to rent than it is to own your home. And I might say, because renting enables you to save money for other expenses, whereas owning, you need to put a larger amount down and therefore can't use that funds in other ways. I'm making assumptions that someone is living a life where they can't easily do both, put down a large down payment and also use the money that they have for other expenses. So in each case, the warrant is this idea that you could say explicitly, like I am now, or that you might not say. So I might just say the claim in the grounds. It's better to rent than it is to own in a city like New York because you can spend your money on other things when you rent, whereas owning requires a large down payment that lots of people don't have. I hope that helped clarify the warrant. If not, please pop another question in the Q&A and I'll try to work with you more. All right, there is a question. Should I include all of my main ideas and arguments in the introduction part? For example, I will write about an exhibition. They did really good in 2 areas and weakened on 1 area. Should I address all these 3 areas in the introduction? Well, you could address all 3 areas in your organizational statement. So I'm assuming that you're making a paper with a thesis. Your organizational statement would then again have the parts of your argument there in depth in the order that you are going to go over them in your paper. So you could, I don't know your assignment, but I'm just going to sort of rip off of it. Let's say the exhibit on Egyptian pottery was a good primer to the subject because it showed a wide range of types of pottery. However, it did not go in depth in any of them, and it did not have any of these key pieces of pottery, right? So everything after the because was an organizational statement. And when I did that, I included all 3 main ideas in my introduction. In fact, I included all 3 main ideas in my thesis. So that's often a stronger thesis because it really does narrow down and focus your argument. I would say give your particular piece of writing a try to see if writing an organizational statement works for you and works for this particular piece of writing. And you can always go ahead and write this and change it later. This reminds me of another point that wasn't asked here, but it was asked to me privately, and I do want to cover it for you. It's what to do when you have a hard time writing introductions, because for some people that introduction is the hardest part. And my big suggestion, and something I do myself, is to actually put a placeholder in. Make sure you've got your thesis down, but the rest of it, just placeholder text in, write the rest of your essay. And once you've finished writing the rest of your essay, you then are in a better position to know what your reader needs to know in order to follow your argument or your paper. So don't, and this goes for your entire paper, honestly, don't get caught in the trap that you need to write your paper in the order that your reader will read it. Write your paper in the order that makes writing it easiest for you. So if you're the type of person who can't deal with a blank page and you've got a really good take on one of your pieces of evidence, write that piece of evidence to get started and go from there. Remember that your professor, your readers, they can't see your drafts until you submit them. They can't see your writing process. Those things serve you. So be kind to yourself when you're writing and find the path of least resistance. All right. I'm going to give people a moment to ask any last questions. All right, we've got one. Someone asks, it's difficult for me to write 300 words for the discussion board. I often write 500 to 700 words to cover all of the arguments. How can I reduce the length of my writing? So remember that a word count is giving you a hint about the depth and the breadth that you should be making. So if it's taking you 500 to 700 words to cover all of the arguments, you're probably going into too much depth into them. So what I would do is check that. The other thing you might want to check is if you have a problem that I certainly do sometimes, and that's wordiness. Do all of the words in your sentences serve a purpose? Are you using 3 words where 1 word could do? And if so, choose your revision point as the time that you keep an eye out for that and then address it. But usually those are the 2 things. You're either going into too much depth if you are only covering the arguments and no more than the arguments. You're either going into too much depth or you are being a little bit wordy. And I don't know which one is the case for you. For me, when I was an undergraduate, it was a little bit of both. So that would be my suggestion for you there. All right, we'll give folks just a little bit of time to make sure there are no last questions. All right. If you think of questions later, please do feel free to email us at firstyear@sps.cuny.edu. We check that email address every business day. So you can go ahead and catch us there. We also have another webinar coming up, very similar to this one, on how to give effective presentations. So if you are taking a course or think you may eventually take a course where you need to give a presentation, you can sign up there and I will see you then. The link to sign up for that presentation has been posted in the chat. We will provide a recording of this webinar as soon as it's available. We'll send it out by email. It can take a little bit of time though, so please be patient. So thank you so much everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening and best of luck in your writing assignments as you move forward. Bye.